The iron gates of St. Catherine's Convent loomed before Princess Isabel Thornberry like the jaws of a tomb, their blackened metal twisted into shapes that resembled weeping angels. She stood in the rain-soaked courtyard, her traveling cloak heavy with water, her heart heavier still with the weight of her father's decree. 21 years of life, and it had come to this: exile disguised as piety, punishment wrapped in prayers. Her crime? She had dared to speak in Parliament, her voice rising above the lords who thought women mere ornaments. She had championed the poor, defied her royal uncle's political machinations, and worst of all, she had refused 3 marriage proposals from men who saw her crown as a prize and her spirit as something to be broken. "Your Highness," the Mother Superior intoned, her voice as cold as the rain, "the King has decreed you shall remain here until you learn submission." Isabel lifted her chin, rain streaming down her face like tears she refused to shed. "Then I shall remain here forever," she whispered, "for I will never learn to be silent." But fate, it seemed, had other plans. London, spring 1838. The season was in full flourish, ballrooms glittering with gaslight and ambition, but Princess Isabel Thornberry would see none of it. Daughter of the late Duke of Thornbury and niece to King William himself, she possessed beauty that painters immortalized and wit that made politicians nervous. Her auburn hair caught fire in sunlight. Her green eyes held the fierce intelligence of someone who read philosophy at dawn and debated policy by afternoon. She was everything a princess should be, except obedient. The Duke of Ravenswood, Lord Adrian Blackwell, was her opposite in every conceivable way. 30 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and politically powerful enough to sway votes in the House of Lords, he was the king's most trusted adviser, the very man who had counseled her exile. Cold, controlled, devoted entirely to duty and crown, he had built his reputation on unwavering loyalty and emotional detachment. Since his young wife's death 5 years prior, he had sealed his heart behind walls of ice and obligation. Their worlds should never have collided, but on a moonlit evening when Isabel scaled the convent walls, seeking one last taste of freedom, she would tumble directly into the Duke's arms in the forbidden garden, and neither of their carefully ordered lives would ever be the same. The convent walls were higher than Isabel had anticipated, the ancient stones slick with moss and evening dew. She pressed herself against the cold surface, her borrowed servant's dress of rough brown wool scratching against skin accustomed to silk. Her auburn hair was bound tightly beneath a plain cap, her face smudged with dirt to obscure her royal features. 3 weeks she had endured this prison of prayer and silence, 3 weeks of watching spring bloom beyond barred windows while her spirit withered like cut flowers. Tonight she would taste freedom, even if only for an hour. Her fingers found purchase in the crumbling mortar, and she pulled herself upward, muscles burning with effort. The garden beyond the walls called to her. Not the convent's austere herb plots, but the wild, sprawling grounds of Ravensmoor Estate, which bordered the convent's eastern edge. She had glimpsed it from her cell window, that forbidden paradise of ancient oaks and midnight roses. The top of the wall scraped her palms bloody, but she ignored the pain, swinging her legs over with unladylike abandon. For one glorious moment she perched atop the barrier between captivity and freedom, the wind catching her cap and sending it tumbling into darkness. Then her foot slipped. Isabel fell through empty air, a scream trapped in her throat, certain she would meet the ground and death together. Instead, she collided with something solid, warm, and decidedly male.
Strong arms caught her against a chest hard as oak, and she found herself staring into eyes of stormy gray that held all the warmth of a winter sea. "Good God!" a deep voice rumbled with shocked displeasure. "What manner of creature falls from the sky?" Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ravenswood, had been seeking solitude in his private garden when chaos quite literally fell into his arms. The figure was slight, dressed in servant's garb, but the moment his hands closed around her waist, he knew this was no common maid. The curve of her body spoke of good breeding. The smoothness of her skin beneath his fingers suggested a life untouched by manual labor. And the way she lifted her chin with unconscious authority marked her as gentry at the very least. "Unhand me at once," she demanded, struggling against his grip with surprising strength. Adrian tightened his hold, studying her dirt-smudged face with growing suspicion. Even in the moonlight, he could see the fine bone structure, the imperious set of her mouth, the flash of green eyes that seemed familiar in a way that sent warning bells clanging through his mind. "Not until you explain why you're trespassing on my property," he replied coolly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience, "and why you risk life and limb scaling convent walls in the dead of night."
She went very still in his arms, and he felt the rapid beating of her heart against his chest.
"The convent? I was merely taking evening air."
"Over a 15-foot wall?" His skepticism was evident. "Try again, and this time favor me with the truth." Her eyes blazed with sudden defiance, and she stopped struggling, instead meeting his gaze with a directness that shocked him. No woman of quality would dare look at him thus, with challenge and fury, and something else he could not quite name.
"Very well,"
she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper.
"The truth is, I would rather die than spend another day in that cage of prayer and false piety."
The moment the words left her lips, Isabel realized her mistake. This man, whoever he was, held her fate in his hands, quite literally. His fingers pressed against the small of her back, burning through the rough fabric of her dress like brands. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the moon. His face was all harsh angles and aristocratic planes, with a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and those gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And why," he asked quietly, dangerously, "should a young woman be imprisoned in St. Catherine's? What crime warrants such confinement?" "The crime of possessing opinions," she shot back, abandoning caution in favor of honesty. Something about this stranger's steady gaze compelled truth. "The crime of speaking when I should remain silent, of thinking when I should merely smile and agree, of believing that women possess minds equal to men and voices that deserve to be heard." She watched something flicker across his stern features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. His grip on her waist loosened fractionally, and she seized the moment, twisting from his grasp with the agility of desperation. But she had forgotten the garden's treacherous terrain. Her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled backward toward an ornamental pond. The Duke's hand shot out with remarkable speed, catching her wrist and pulling her forward, directly against his chest once more. This time, their faces were mere inches apart. She could feel his breath against her cheek, smell the scent of sandalwood, and something darker, more masculine. His eyes widened with sudden, terrible recognition.
"Dear God," he breathed. "Princess Isabel." Adrian's mind reeled with the implications of holding King William's niece crushed against him in a moonlit garden, dressed as a servant and clearly attempting escape. He had been present at the Privy Council meeting where her exile had been decreed, had even argued for leniency, though his suggestions had fallen on deaf ears. The king wanted his troublesome niece silenced, and St. Catherine's offered the perfect solution: isolation disguised as spiritual retreat.
"You know me," Isabel said, flatly, ceasing her struggles. There was resignation in her voice, but also a defiant tilt to her chin that struck him as magnificent despite his better judgment. "Then you know that returning me to that place is condemning me to a living death." "I know that you publicly challenged the Prime Minister's factory bill," Adrian replied, though he did not release her. Some traitorous part of him enjoyed the feel of her in his arms, the warmth of her body against his, the way her eyes flashed with unrepentant fire. "I know you wrote pamphlets advocating for women's education, that you spoke before Parliament without permission, that you refused marriage proposals from 3 suitable lords." "Suitable," she spat the word like poison. "Lord Pemberton, who beats his servants, Viscount Aldridge, who keeps 2 mistresses and a gambling debt that would bankrupt lesser men, and Baron Hartwell, who told me quite plainly that once wed, I would be forbidden from reading anything more challenging than fashion plates." Adrian felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest, something dangerously close to admiration. "And yet you are still a princess, bound by duty to crown and country. Your rebellion serves no one, least of all yourself." "My rebellion," Isabel said softly, her green eyes holding his with devastating directness, "is all I have left." The night air had grown cold, or perhaps it was merely the ice in the Duke's voice that made Isabel shiver. He still held her wrist, his fingers a manacle of warm flesh and barely restrained strength. She could feel his pulse beating against her skin, rapid despite his composed demeanor. This man was not as unaffected as he pretended. "I should return you immediately," said Adrian, but made no move to do so. "It is my duty to the crown." "Duty," Isabel laughed bitterly. "That word again. Does it never tire you, Your Grace, this endless sacrifice of every human feeling on the altar of obligation?" His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "You know nothing of my feelings, Your Highness."
"Don't I?" She stepped closer, emboldened by desperation and the intoxicating freedom of having nothing left to lose. "I know you advised leniency at my sentencing. I have sources within the palace still. I know you argued that exile was excessive, that education and spirit should not be crimes requiring punishment." Surprise flickered across his features. "How?" "Because I am not the helpless ornament they wish me to be," Isabel interrupted. "I listen, I learn, I remember. And I know that somewhere beneath all that devotion to duty, there is a man who understands that justice and blind obedience are not always the same thing." Adrian stared at her, and in his eyes she saw a war being waged, duty against conscience, obligation against mercy. Finally he spoke, his voice rough with barely suppressed emotion. "If I do not return you tonight, they will discover your absence by morning prayers. The scandal will be immeasurable. Your reputation will be destroyed beyond all redemption." "My reputation," Isabel whispered, "was destroyed the moment I chose to speak. I have nothing left to lose, Your Grace. But you could look away, just this once. What do you think will happen next? Will Princess Isabel's dangerous bargain with the Duke lead to freedom or a different kind of captivity? Can a marriage built on convenience transform into something real, or will their opposing worlds tear them apart? Drop your predictions in the comments below. I love reading your theories, and some of you have been absolutely brilliant at guessing the twists before they happen. Now, let's continue with the story, because the Duke and Princess are about to face their greatest test yet. Adrian released her wrist as though burned, stepping back and running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of profound agitation. He paced the garden path, his boots crunching on gravel, while Isabel waited with held breath, watching moonlight play across his aristocratic features.
He was a beautiful man, she realized with some surprise, not in the soft way of courtiers, but with the hard edges of someone carved by grief and responsibility. "You ask me to betray my king," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous, "to abandon every principle I have built my life upon. I ask you to help one woman reclaim her life, to show mercy where the law shows only cruelty."
He turned to face her, and the expression in his gray eyes made her heart stutter. There was something raw there, something wounded and wanting, that called to her own desperate longing for freedom and understanding. "If I do this," Adrian said slowly, each word seeming to cost him dearly, "if I do not report your escape, it must be on certain conditions. You cannot simply vanish into London. Within hours, every constable and soldier in England will be searching for you. Your face is too well known, your absence too significant." Hope blazed in Isabel's chest, dangerous and intoxicating. "What are you suggesting?" "You need protection, a legitimate reason for leaving St. Catherine's that will satisfy the king and prevent scandal." He paused, and she saw him make some internal decision, his shoulders squaring as though preparing for battle. "You need a husband." The word hung between them like a sword. "A husband?" Isabel's voice emerged strangled. "I fled the convent to escape precisely that fate." "Not a prison," Adrian said quietly, his eyes holding hers with sudden burning intensity. "A partnership. My name, my protection, my position, in exchange for your freedom. A marriage of convenience that serves us both." Isabel's mind struggled to comprehend the Duke's words. Marriage to Adrian Blackwell would solve her immediate problem. She would leave St. Catherine's not as an escaped prisoner, but as a bride. Yet it felt like trading one cage for another, however gilded. "Why would you do this?" she demanded, searching his face for deception or ulterior motive. "You barely know me. I am the troublesome princess your king wished silenced. Wedding me would complicate your political position immeasurably." Adrian's expression remained unreadable, carved from marble and moonlight. "Perhaps I am weary of being the crown's perfect servant. Perhaps I see in your situation an injustice that offends my conscience. Or perhaps," he paused, something vulnerable flickering across his features before being locked away, "perhaps I understand better than you imagine what it means to live in a cage, even one built from duty and honor." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any touch. Isabel saw past his aristocratic reserve to the man beneath, lonely, trapped by his own rigid code of honor, seeking something he could not name. "What manner of marriage?" she asked carefully. "What would you expect from me?"
"Nothing you do not freely give," Adrian replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your intelligence, your conversation, your presence at social functions where a duchess is required. Beyond that," he gestured vaguely, "we would maintain separate chambers, separate lives. I ask only that you moderate your public rebellions enough to avoid scandal that would damage both our positions." "You ask me to become complicit in my own silencing," Isabel said bitterly. "I ask you to choose which battles are worth fighting," Adrian corrected, "and I offer you weapons you do not currently possess, wealth, position, my library of 10,000 volumes, and freedom to pursue your causes through channels that might actually affect change rather than merely create spectacle." Despite herself, Isabel felt tempted. The garden seemed to hold its breath as Isabel weighed her impossible choice: return to the convent's suffocating prayers, or bind herself to this stern, complicated man who offered freedom at the price of her name and independence. She studied the Duke's face, seeking some hint of his true motivations beyond the practical arguments he presented.
"You loved your first wife," she said suddenly, watching for his reaction. "Lady Catherine. She died of consumption 5 years ago. You have worn mourning far longer than custom demands." Pain lanced across Adrian's features before his control reasserted itself, but she had seen enough. Here was grief, genuine and deep, carefully concealed beneath layers of aristocratic composure. "Catherine was everything a duchess should be," he said tightly. "Gentle, obedient, devoted to charitable works. She never once challenged me or caused scandal. Her death," his voice cracked almost imperceptibly, "was a loss I shall carry always." "Then why offer marriage to her opposite?" Isabel pressed, moving closer until she could see the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. The fine lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "I am everything she was not, rebellious, outspoken, devoted to causes that make powerful men uncomfortable. I will bring you nothing but political complication." Adrian met her gaze, and for one unguarded moment she saw something blazing in those gray depths that took her breath away. Not love, but fascination, challenge, a hunger for something beyond the empty perfection of his carefully ordered life. "Perhaps I have had enough of gentle obedience. Perhaps I want something real, even if it means discomfort and challenge. Perhaps you remind me that there are things worth fighting for, beyond mere duty." Isabel felt her resistance crumbling like the convent's walls she had scaled. "Very well, Your Grace. I accept your devil's bargain."
Adrian felt triumph and terror war within his chest as Princess Isabel's acceptance hung in the night air between them. He had just committed himself to an alliance that would shock society and complicate his political position immeasurably. Yet looking at her dirt-smudged face, those defiant green eyes still blazing with unbroken spirit despite weeks of confinement, he could not bring himself to regret the offer. "We must move quickly," he said, shifting into the practical planning that had always been his refuge from emotion. "I shall call upon the Mother Superior tomorrow morning with a formal proposal. The king will be displeased, but even he cannot refuse when I petition as your suitor. My loyalty has earned me certain privileges." "He will suspect this is a scheme," Isabel warned. "My uncle knows I would never willingly marry, especially not his most devoted advisor." "Then we must convince him otherwise." Adrian stepped closer, and she tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, that unconscious gesture of pride making something warm unfurl in his chest. "We must appear besotted, passionately attached. Society must believe this is a love match, however sudden. You ask me to lie." But there was no heat in her accusation, only weary acceptance of necessity. "I ask you to perform," Adrian corrected, "as you have performed propriety all your life while hiding your true thoughts. Surely you can manage to perform affection for a few weeks until the marriage is accomplished." Isabel's laugh was bitter music. "And after, when we are wed and the performance is no longer necessary?" "After," Adrian said quietly, "we determine what manner of partnership we wish to build. But first we must secure your freedom." He extended his hand, palm upward, an offer, not a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Isabel placed her hand in his, and the contact sent an unexpected jolt through his carefully controlled composure. "Until tomorrow, then," she whispered. Dawn found Isabel back in her narrow convent cell, smuggled through the garden gate by a duke who moved through shadows with surprising stealth. She lay upon the hard mattress, her body aching from the night's exertions, her mind spinning with the enormity of what she had agreed to. Marriage to Adrian Blackwell, Duchess of Ravenswood. It seemed impossible, a fever dream born of desperation.
Yet when the Mother Superior summoned her to the receiving parlor that morning, she found the Duke already present, dressed in impeccable mourning clothes of deep charcoal, every inch the powerful aristocrat. He stood when she entered, his gray eyes finding hers across the room, and she saw the faintest flicker of relief that she had kept their bargain. "Princess Isabel," he said formally, bowing with perfect correctness, "I have come to request the honor of your hand in marriage." The Mother Superior's gasp was audible. "Your Grace, surely you jest. This girl is here by royal decree, punishment for her unseemly behavior." "This woman," Adrian interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "is a princess of the blood, possessed of remarkable intelligence and spirit. I have long admired her from a distance, and upon reflection, I find I can no longer live without her as my wife." He crossed the room to stand before Isabel, and she saw the challenge in his eyes. The performance begins now. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with all the defiant fire she possessed, and spoke the words that would seal her fate. "The honor is mine, your Grace. I accept your proposal with a full heart." The Duke's smile was slight but genuine, and when he raised her hand to his lips, the kiss he pressed to her knuckles burned like a brand. Their dangerous charade had begun, but neither could have predicted how swiftly performance would blur into dangerous reality. Thank you so much for staying with us through Princess Isabel and Duke Adrian's extraordinary journey, from a desperate escape over convent walls to a love that defied a kingdom's expectations. And if you enjoyed this tale of feminine power and rebellious love, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you new historical romance stories every single week. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Your likes, comments, and shares help us grow this community of romance lovers, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. See you on the next one.